So welcome to our first e-Salon, but we're with Alejandro Gil, who's our graphic facilitator. So many of you will have seen him before. So he's going to be doing a visual representation, oh, there we go, of the talk and the discussion this evening. First up this evening is Thomas Hylland Eriksen, who's an extremely distinguished anthropologist, and he's a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo. And some of you may have met him previously because he spoke at Full Circle in November 2016. It seems like a really long time ago. And his talk was all about how it is to live in an era of accelerated change and what it means for us and how it puts strains on our societies and on ourselves. And he's got a lot more thinking and ideas to share with us in the light of the current pandemic. So that's what he's going to be speaking about this evening. And he's going to be followed by Albena Azmanova, who's a Full Circle member based in Brussels, and she's also Professor of Social and Political Thought at the Brussels campus of the University of Kent. And she recently published a very well-received book called Capitalism on Edge, and she'll be looking at some of the economic lessons of the crisis, but also the economic lessons of previous crises, where things might have gone as you might not have gone as you might have expected. And so she'll be asking, like, how can we ever manage to do things differently? And then our third speaker this evening is Stephen Coleman, who I saw earlier. So he's Professor of Political Communication at the University of Leeds, and he's also Research Associate at the Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford University. And he specialises in novel methods of political engagement and online deliberation. So he must be thoroughly enjoying the whole confinement era. And he'll be talking about slow democracy and new ways of engaging and deciding that allow adequate time for reflection and revision. Now, I said each speaker has 12 minutes. I have no subtle way of indicating to you when your time is up, so I'm really relying on you this evening. But I'd like to pass the floor now to Thomas. Over to you.
So I think I'm unmuted. So thanks very much. And this is a very interesting experiment. I mean, we're starting to have these meetings now, and I think we'll slowly be getting the hang of it, but we're not quite there yet. But it's an exciting experiment, and I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this. So thank you to Bridie and Louise in Full Circle for making this happen. Now, what I'm going to do in my 12 minutes to begin with, and we can return to some of these issues as we go along, is to reflect on the pandemic in the context of overheating, but also in the context of the enforced cooling down that we experienced with a vengeance, brutally and suddenly, just a few weeks ago in much of the world. I do not have any final answers to offer. I think that this is a conversation that we need to have about where we're going after the pandemic. And it's a conversation which is only just starting, and where it's crucial that we use our humanity, our imagination, our experiences and our knowledge in order to envision what the world could and should look like after the pandemic, because it's not going to be the same. We've lived in an overheated world now for a long time. By overheating, I do not merely refer to, or even primarily refer to, climate change, although that's part of the story. Overheating is about speed. Speed and heat in physics are two sides of the same coin. So it's about what I call the acceleration of acceleration, which took off, I mean, roughly around 1990, the end of the Cold War, the coming of the internet, the deregulation of the Indian economy, the advent of the new mobile phones, you know, these things which look now like this, which didn't look like that in the early 90s, but which came into the world and served to enhance efficiency, connectivity, speed, and so on and so forth. That is the kind of world in which we've lived now for about 30 years, and where you see all of these indicators, many of the forms of growth and change and speed that have been with us since the Industrial Revolution suddenly took a rather sharp turn upwards and started to accelerate. Only since the 1980s, the number of tourist arrivals in the world has doubled. It's increased sixfold, from 200 million to 1.2 billion. air traffic, I mean, civilian air traffic grew only from 2004 to 2019, from 2 billion to 4.5 billion. It more than doubled in just 15 years. And I could have gone on. I could have spoken about energy use, about the growth of cities, about information technologies, and about various forms of mobility, including trade, which has quadrupled since 1980. World trade has quadrupled. It's increased 4 times. So in other words, we're talking about a period of incredible, unprecedented, accelerated change. The thing about this change, and the reason why I'm calling it not just heating, but overheating, is that there is no thermostat. You see, there is no instance. It's like a furnace, which just gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And there's no instance, no governor, no caretaker or janitor who can walk over to the furnace and turn down the heat. Or a thermostat, which can regulate it automatically. When it reaches 22 degrees, it's fine. You can cool down now. There's no such instance, which means that it's a fairly risky situation, which creates a lot of vulnerability for reasons which are increasingly becoming well known. The most famous side effect, of course, of overheating being global climate change, the paradoxical way in which we undermine the conditions of our own existence, that the causes of our well-being in our parts of the world and in the global middle classes across the planet are exactly the same as the causes of that very way of life's undoing. So what we've experienced now, which I understand and I interpret through an overheating framework, is that what we've seen is, for many years, people, experts, researchers, some politicians, environmental movements, activists, and indigenous groups and so on, have been pleading with world leaders to slow down, cool down, and scale down. Nothing has happened. Well, symbolic things have happened. Nothing much has happened. It's been business as usual until March 2020, when we were forced to cool down, when civilian air traffic, which had more than doubled in just 15 years, was reduced by 94% between March 2019 and March 2020. Just to give you one example, and as you know just as well as me, we have lived through a dramatic change in our way of life. Yes, it is temporary. Yes, it's not going to stay this way. Yes, we will be able to meet physically in Brussels or elsewhere, probably within the next year. But things are not going to be the same again. And I am one of the people who thinks that we can use this opportunity, we can use this window of opportunity to reflect critically on the world that we've created and rethink some of its features. What we're talking about here is the sudden visibility of all of these invisible threads and networks and movements that held our waves of life together. It's almost like sort of peering behind the computer program in the Matrix, or it's like when you walk on the street every day, you walk over piping, tubes, you know, all of the plumbing that gives you water in your tap, and you never give it a thought before the tap runs dry. And the moment the tap runs dry, you become incredibly interested in where the water is coming from. And this is exactly what's happening with globalization. Suddenly, we see the scaffolding, we see all of the trappings and the infrastructure of globalization, which has been invisible to most of us until now. So it's a window through which we can see ourselves and the conditions that produce us, and raise some critical questions about where we want to go. And one of the ways in which we see this is through butterfly effects. The vulnerabilities of globalization. The butterfly effect, you know, the anecdote of the butterfly flapping its tiny wings somewhere in Brazil, so creating a very, very, very faint sort of a stream of air, which mixes with the larger stream of air, changes the direction of that, and so on and so forth. And before you know it, there's a blizzard in New York and a hurricane in the Caribbean. You know, that's a short version of the butterfly effect. How small causes can have very large effects, as an illustration of interconnectedness and of vulnerability. So what happened now is that, you know, somewhere in Wuhan, probably, someone probably who was buying or who was just soliciting a purchase in the market of Wuhan, got unlucky, so he got infected with a disease which seemed like a flu. And a few months later, people who run tourist businesses in Svalbard, in the far Arctic north of Norway, are going bankrupt because there are no longer any tourists. Airlines are grounded. People talk about the shrinking of the economy by a factor of 30%, but nobody really knows. And we're still in a liminal stage here when it comes to both the disease as such and its long-term effects. We don't really know. So this is the time to think about alternatives. We've had global crises before. We've had global pandemics before. The Black Death, which indirectly or partly led to the end of feudalism and the heralding of the modern world, and which enabled eventually the Ottomans to take over most of North Africa and the Middle East. No small feat for a disease. We've seen for Europeans, trivial diseases that were exported to the Americas after the conquest in 1492, which led to the virtual eradication of the native populations of the Americas, and leading to a much easier situation for people who were the settler colonialists. And so we've seen this before. We've seen how big pandemics can have lasting historical consequences. And I'm convinced that at the moment we are living through a moment of world historical significance. Obviously, being in the middle of it, we don't know where it's going to end, but that's, to some extent, it's up to us how it's going to end. We've had other global crises recently, and we have one currently, the climate crisis, which shares some characteristics. It says something about interconnectedness and about global vulnerability, that we are one humanity and we're in this together. But it also has some traits which it does not share with the COVID-19 pandemic, namely speed. It's much slower, it's sluggish, it's gradual, and it comes with stealth, indirectly, and in a gradual way, whereas this disaster came super fast and suddenly. Now, so what are the possibilities? I have notes. I'm not going to go through all of them because I'm running out of time, so I'll just skip what I was going to say about the dangers of xenophobic nationalism as a sort of instinctive reaction to this virus which comes from the outside, which is Chinese or European or whatever, of which we've seen signs, not only in the United States, not only in Europe, but also in Africa. In Ghana, for example, where there has been instances of xenophobic reactions to Europeans, because Europeans were the ones who brought the coronavirus to Ghana. I'm not going to talk about that now, but maybe we can discuss it later on. The relationship between nationalism on the one hand and the more cosmopolitan global humanism on the other as an ideological outcome of the corona crisis. But let me end by saying just a couple of things about some of the positive possibilities that might emerge out of this crisis, which of course at the moment is painful, it's difficult, it's worrying, and it's unwanted. And there are some immediate problems that need to be solved to do with employment, to do with precarity, to do with poverty, and so on and so forth, not least in the global south. So by all means, let us not underestimate those problems. But following this, maybe we should do things differently. Maybe we should think more in terms of a human economy than in terms of a neoliberal capitalist economy. Maybe we should rethink the self-destructive aspects of global neoliberalism, the way in which we are, as I was saying at the outset, we are undermining the conditions of our own existence through environmental destruction and overexploitation of resources, the way in which we, in the space of just a few generations, are burning off fossil fuels, fossil resources that it took the planet, 60 million years or more to produce. Rather irresponsible. Perhaps we should talk less about human rights and more about human duties. There are many options here. And my point is that now we have this window of opportunity because we have a liminal stage where there is uncertainty and there is anxiety and lots of people worry for the future, and we can create the future ourselves. And it can be an improvement related to what was before. So thank you for now, and I hope to be able to return to some of these topics during the discussion.
Thank you very much. That's a great way for us to start off, because you put everything on the table in a very short space of time. Thank you for that. And I think it also fits very well with what Albena is going to be saying. So Albena, I'll just hand straight over to you And I'm going to just unmute you.
Lower.
Oh, there we go, you're done. Feel good. Okay, it's over to you.
Hello, good evening. Very happy to be here. So we tend to call the current situation a crisis. So let's stay with that. For any crisis, there are three possible solutions: death, return to the pre-crisis situation, and transition to something new, right? In terms of crisis, people tend to say, we get revolutionary, eager to go for the new thing. But in fact, this is not the case. People in context of crisis tend to get conservative. They tend to idealize the pre-crisis situation and long to return to it. For me, this is, one of the biggest dangers standing in front of us. So I hope the virus is going to spare our memory, is not going to damage our memory, and we will remember that things were not that great before the crisis. So I propose, rather than speaking about crisis, we see ourselves as standing at a peculiar moment in history, akin to a blue moon. I would call that an interlude. History stops in its tracks, looks around, doesn't know where to go. It's not just a crossroad because there are many opportunities there. The peculiarity of our interlude is that we have slowed down. Often crises, think of revolutionary crises, they're bloody, they go very fast, they're unruly. We have in fact slowed down, and this is something very positive. In times of when we slow down, we have the possibility of becoming more wise, to look at the past and think long term. So let's do together exactly this. What has the pandemic brought to light from our past? It has deepened and brought to light economic inequalities, laid them bare. There's a very clear divide between poor and rich, between those who can stay in their wonderful homes and those who are cramped in tiny apartments and houses with maybe abusive partners. Those who are exposed to the dangers of the virus and have to choose between getting the virus or death, or losing their job, losing their job or losing or their life. So indeed, the pandemic has laid bare these inequalities about which we used to talk a lot about before the crisis. The pandemic has exposed also our common humanity, the cosmopolitan humanism. Now it's all put to verse. We feel very good about ourselves and the world when we are exposed to these wonderful gestures of solidarity, applauding. Sure, the pandemic has exposed our common vulnerability of rich and poor to health problems. But it should be also making clear that we're all afflicted by another situation that I describe in my book as massive precarity. I do not mean the precarity of poverty that Guy Standing has called the precarious class, right? I talk about the precarity as a social condition, politically generated, politically crafted social condition of insecurity that afflicts the 99%. It has been in the making for quite some time, and it has been caused mostly by three factors. Automation. Jobs have been disappearing even in high-skilled sectors such as the legal profession and IT. Because of this, jobs are shifting to countries because the ease that IT, information technology is allowing, our jobs are shifting to countries with cheaper labor. And this is not just the low-skilled jobs, but also the high-skilled jobs. Think about the call centers in India, IT engineers. So across the class divide. The second factor has been trade liberalization since the 1980s, globalization, the creation of the global free market. Foreign direct investment has allowed for jobs to run away from the West to the rest, to countries also of cheap labor, because the gains are higher. For the sake, the third factor, for the sake of competitiveness, at least since around the year 2000, the competitiveness of national economies in the global marketplace has become a top policy priority. If we read the policy papers, it's really striking how this is the top policy priority. So because of that prioritization of making our economies competitive in the global free market, investment in public services such as health, education, science, culture, all was scaled down for the sake of that competitiveness. Again, jobs were made less secure in order to allow the business the flexibility to hire and fire according to the needs of the market. So as a result of all this, we have faced what I call the contradiction of contemporary capitalism, that we have all become more dependent for our well-being on employment, since the welfare state has contracted a lot of, for a lot of the basic things we need to pay out of our pocket, as education, healthcare, everything is less available. So we rely more for securing our well-being on employment that is disappearing and is less stable. This creates a condition of fear, of anxiety. No wonder that mental health disease has increased among highly skilled workers. In my book, I go over those interesting statistics, that low-skilled workers are affected with this physical precarity. High-skilled workers are more affected with mental health issues, but this all goes down to this social precaritization, which is politically constructed by those three factors that I went over. And I call the current capitalism because of this precarity capitalism. So the virus has not made us more vulnerable as a result of the contamination, but the contamination, the impact of the contamination has been greater because of this underlying social precarity. So what's next? I hope we remember that already before the health crisis, we were talking a lot about crisis. And interestingly, we were talking about crisis at least for 10 years. Now, if you talk about a crisis, does not last 10 years. It's usually a very short situation in the life of an entity that passes quickly, either death, transition to new, or recovery. But we've been talking about crisis for 10 years. That is why I speak in my book about a condition I call the crisis of the crisis. So the society, even as the economy recovered from the financial meltdown of 2008, our societies continued to experience themselves in a crisis situation exactly because of this massive precarity. So mostly, what I would be eager that we change this situation of social precarity and build what I describe as a political economy of trust. In order to go in this direction, first, so I propose that we bust until two myths that have been limiting our horizon, constraining our thinking. The first myth is that capitalism is the engine of prosperity and economic progress. Actually, science is at the root of that. Capitalism is one of many possible transmission mechanisms that help direct the achievement of science into society through a process of making profit. But the pandemic has revealed that something that we should have known well for a long time, that it also directs human effort away from things which, very important things, which do not make profit, such as vaccines. So note that the news about vaccine breakthroughs come from universities' research centers. It's simply because it is against the economic logic of capitalism to invest in something that through which you cannot make profit. Okay, so this is the first myth we need to bust. The other myth is that, that's the great myth on the left, is that inequality is the great social evil of our times. Now, our obsession with inequality, I find very narrow-minded. Even in the Communist Manifesto, if we go read it, there is no mention of equality as a value. There is a mention of solidarity, but this is quite a different matter. According to Marx, for instance, in a communist society, everybody would receive according to their needs and contribute according to their capacity, not everybody the same. We can very well imagine societies that are poor and equal, or rich and equal but precarious. So let us focus on fighting social precarity, I would say, by building a political economy of trust through investment in public services, through securing for everybody their basic needs regarding education, healthcare, culture, and only when these essential things are lacking, when people feel generally precarious, whether they're rich or poor, then inequality becomes a social problem, because we become reliant on our financial resources to secure those needs. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Albena. I would like to turn to Stephen next.
Thank you. I guess what we can all agree about is that we're in trouble. Humans have not been evolving for thousands of years so that we lock ourselves in our home. So something somewhere we can all agree has gone wrong. But what we've heard about so far are the systemic consequences of this trouble. The potential, it has been suggested, for the radical reconfiguration of global relationships. And maybe after this crisis, global relationships will be reconfigured, but maybe they won't. So my aim is rather more modest and small scale. I want to ask, what does this crisis tell us about how people learn to be citizens? And I want to make three preliminary observations. And the first might not seem obvious, and that is, it's not easy to be a citizen. It's pretty easy to be a consumer. You just need a certain amount of money in your pocket. You go to the market and you sort of let your belly do the talking. It's quite easy to be an audience, particularly for the mass media. You sit back and you wait for the kind of cultural incontinence to come towards you. But it's not easy to be a citizen. I mean, most of us don't have a lot of time in the day when we sit down and think, how am I going to coexist with other citizens? People I don't know, people I possibly will never really even be able to understand, and I might not like, but I have to live with them. The language of citizenship, the language of politics and democracy in particular, is very often opaque, it's confusing, it's time consuming, and it is no surprise a lot of people disengage from it. So the first thing that we can say is, whatever we want to say about learning to be citizens, it's hard work, not easy work. The second thing to say is that civic practices, like any other form of social behavior, are learned. I mean, they're not natural. And sometimes you have to learn them really quickly. So for example, if you would have asked me at the beginning of this year what social distancing is, it would have been an unknown concept to me. I mean, I can think of a number of people I quite have liked to have social distance from at the time if I'd have known what the concept meant, but I didn't. And you learn. And as time goes on, it becomes technical learning. How many meters is social distancing? What do I have to do if I'm in a supermarket? What do I have to do if I'm walking down the street and I see someone? We learn these things. And the way in which we learn them is cultural. They're not obvious. They're not natural. They're learned, and they are also taught through a process of socialization. And the third preliminary observation I want to make is that there is more than one way of performing citizenship at any one time. For example, you think of voters. I wrote a book called How Voters Feel, about the most mundane aspect of democracy, voting. And there were some people who told me, I love voting. There are other people who told me, I don't even know what voting is. I interviewed an 18-year-old woman with 2 children, and she didn't know what the concept meant. Voting, demonstrating, rioting, these are all forms of citizenship. You can perform them in different ways. Now, what I want to ask is how our traditionally rather thin and impoverished ties of citizenship might be strengthened or might be weakened as a result of the current pandemic. So let me make some observations about the current situation. The first is that, contrary to beliefs that it is incompatible with modernity, life has actually slowed down. I mean, everyone has said, sociologists to everyday people sitting on a bus, that everything's speeding up, and life has actually slowed down. We have been able to slow it down. And we are learning habits of tranquility and domestic security that were not obvious to us, and that perhaps some of us have started to forget. Interesting ones, which may suggest something about the slowing down of our civic life, the slowing down of the rush to judgment. The second thing is that whilst life has slowed down, nature moves quickly, and too quickly for us to comprehend. So we have a classical case of what we call desynchronization between the human cognitive and emotional capacity to cope with the changing world and the change. You know, the pandemic actually has traumatized a lot of people, and a lot of the mental health problems are not just to do with loneliness, they're to do with the shock of something having happened so quickly. And this raises important questions about what we have traditionally thought of as epistemic duality, the Kahneman argument, the fast thinking, slow thinking argument, about whether we think fast and when we should think fast, and when do we think slow. And Kahneman and Tversky have written a fascinating book about the contrast between these two levels of thinking. And it seems that although we have got very used to fast thinking, slow thinking is sometimes really necessary when confronted with new and complex problems. The third observation I want to make about the current situation is that norms of recognition are being recast. That is to say, you think of the clapping in this country, Britain, for the National Health Service, for healthcare workers across the world. This is a different kind of recognition for from the recognition that we had grown used to over a long time. And it is connected with practices of autonomous collective improvisation and empathetic solidarity that are emerging. So I have some practical questions, and I think they really are practical questions, and they're questions that we're thinking about very seriously at the moment in my university and amongst my research groups. First of all, and I ask you to consider these questions. First of all, can forms of democratic self-determination be sustained and built upon in the post-pandemic world? I mean, to translate, are we all being very, very nice to each other when we are all fearing for our lives, and then we stop fearing for our lives and we act like a lot of shits? So the question is there a sustainability to this new kind of self-determined solidarity? The second question, I think, is a really important question. How can we creatively evaluate global examples of new civic practice? How do we create what I would call an inventory of innovative democratic practices? I mean, all of you will know we have what's called the FTSE every day. We have the Dow Jones Index. It measures a certain kind of productivity, or at least a euphemism for productivity. But we don't have that in terms of democratic citizenship. We have nothing that measures very well how well we are doing, and particularly in terms of innovative behavior. And my third question that I would like you to take on board is, how do we learn the habits of collective civic creativity? How do we turn citizenship from that kind of terrible civics education that goes on in schools all over the world, which is a lot to do with saluting the flag and learning which parliamentary house has which powers, and how do we move that into a process of civic unlearning, where we throw away some of those rather impoverished ideas of citizenship and we move towards creative ideas? So I want to conclude with some suggested answers of my own. One, this is not the end of the crisis. The crisis after this crisis may well be worse than the one we have now. And that, of course, is going to be the economic crisis, when possibly a quarter of the world's economy will have collapsed by the time we come out of this pandemic. We're moving into a period of recession. A recession is a growth under 2%, where we might be going to minus 25%. We're around about minus 8% in the financial crash at the beginning of this century. So how do we avoid closing down imaginative responses? And my answer is, we need imaginative, slower thinking politics that enable us to deliberate about the options before us in this totally new economic territory that we are about to enter. Second answer that I offer, I think we have to encourage considered pro-social civic practices by providing people with what I would call semiotic resources. So the clapping that has taken place, I don't regard as incidental or trite. I think it's actually a new civic ritual, and an important one. Because what's really going on here, I think, is a celebration of human caring. A form of celebration of caring that was downgraded in the period of the mean world economy that only ever celebrated profit. Something semiotically is changing in terms of the resources we have available to articulate our humanity. And the importance of those semiotic resources cannot be understated. I think back to the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when eccentrically, against all of the traditions of opening ceremonies, what was celebrated were people lying in beds being looked after by nurses in the National Health Service in Britain. And what was said was, if you want to know why this country is great, that's why it's great. It's not its army, it's not because it conquered large parts of the world, it's because it looks after people without charging them money for it. So I want to conclude by saying, I don't think any of us have all the answers, but I think what we have are imaginative capacities. And those imaginative capacities have got to be protected, both during this period of fear and after it's over, when we return to what is rather horribly referred to as normality.